Section 7 of Irish Wit and Humour. The author is anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by JCarson. Daniel O'Connell. Part 1. Darby Moran. O'Connell, in his celebrated speech in the defence of the Reverend T. Maguire, relates the following story, in which the reader will not fail to perceive the little chance which perjury had in escaping his detection. "Allow me," said he, addressing the court, "to tell you a story which is not the worse for being perfectly true. I was assessor of the sheriff at an election in the county of Clare. A freeholder came to vote under the name of Darby Moran, and as Darby Moran both his signature and mark were attached to the certificate of registry. He, of course, was objected to. It was insisted that he was illiterate. He could not have written his name. If literate, he should not have added his mark. In either view it was contended, with the vehemence suited to such occasions, that his registry was bad. It is, wherever I have authority to adjudicate, a rule with me to decide as few abstract propositions as I possibly can. I therefore resolved first to ascertain the fact whether Darby Moran could write or not. I accordingly gave him paper, and asked him could he write his name. He flippantly answered that he could, and in my presence instantly wrote down John O'Brien. He totally forgot that he was playing Darby Moran. Thus this trick was exposed and defeated. A dead man with life in him. It was difficult for O'Connell, even at an advanced period of his professional career, to exhibit those powers as an advocate which were afterwards so finely developed. For the silk gown that encased inferior merit gave a precedence to Protestant lawyers of even younger standing, and he rarely had an opportunity of addressing a jury. This probably induced him to cultivate with more ardor a talent for cross-examination, which was unquestionably unrivalled, and which was displayed by him at a very early period. It exhibited itself very strongly in a trial on the Munster circuit, in which the question was the validity of a will, by which property to some amount was devised, and which the plaintiffs alleged was forged. The subscribing witnesses swore that the deceased signed the will while life was in him. The evidence was going strong in favour of the will. At last O'Connell undertook to cross-examine one of the witnesses. He shrewdly observed that he was particular in swearing several times that life was in the testator when the will was signed, and that he saw his hand sign it. "By virtue of your oath, was he alive?" said Mr. O'Connell. "By virtue of my oath, life was in him," and this the witness repeated several times. "Now," continued O'Connell, with great solemnity, and assuming an air of inspiration, "I call on you, in presence of your Maker, before whom you must one day be judged for the evidence you give here to day, I solemnly ask, and answer me at your peril. Was it not a live fly that was in the dead man's mouth when his hand was placed on the will?" The witness fell instantaneously on his knees, and acknowledged it was so, and that the fly was placed in the mouth of the deceased to enable the witnesses to swear that life was in him. The intuitive quickness with which O'Connell conjectured the cause of the fellow's always swearing that life was in him obtained for him the admiration of every one in court, and very materially assisted in securing his professional success. A young Judge Dunn. In the course of his attendance at the assizes in Cork, he was counsel in a case in which his client was capitally charged, and was so little likely to escape, and was actually so guilty of the crime, that his attorney considered the case utterly desperate. O'Connell entered the court aware of the hopelessness of his client's chances. He knew it was useless to attempt a defence in the ordinary way. There was evidence sufficient to ensure a conviction. At that time it happened that the present Chief Justice, then Sergeant Lefroy, presided, in the absence of one of the judges who had fallen ill. O'Connell understood the sort of man he had on the bench. He opened the defence by putting to the first witness a number of the most illegal questions. He of course knew they were illegal, and that objections would be raised. Sergeant Gould was the Crown Prosecutor, and he started up and expressed his objections. The learned Chief Justice declared his concurrence, and decided peremptorily that he could not allow Mr. O'Connell to proceed with his line of examination. "Well, then, my lord," said O'Connell, after a little expostulation, "as you refuse permitting me to defend my client, I leave his fate in your hands." And he flung his brief from him, adding, as he turned away, "The blood of that man, my lord, will be on your head if he is condemned." O'Connell then left the court. In half an hour afterwards, as he was walking on the flagway outside, the attorney for the defence ran out to him without his hat. "Well," said O'Connell, "he is found guilty?" "No, sir," answered the solicitor, "he has been acquitted." O'Connell is said to have smiled meaningly on the occasion, as if he had anticipated the effect of the ruse; for it was a ruse he had recourse to, in order to save the unfortunate culprit's life. He knew that flinging the onus on a young and raw judge could be the only chance for his client. The judge did take up the case O'Connell had ostensibly, in a pet, abandoned. The witnesses were successively cross-examined by the judge himself. He conceived a prejudice in favor of the accused. He, perhaps, had a natural timidity of incurring the responsibility thrown on him by O'Connell. He charged the jury in the prisoner's favor, and the consequence was the unexpected acquittal of the prisoner. "I knew," said O'Connell afterwards, "the only chance was to throw the responsibility on the judge." O'Connell and a snarling attorney. O'Connell could be seen to greatest advantage in an Irish court of justice. There he displayed every quality of the lawyer and the advocate. He showed perfect mastery of his profession, and he exhibited his own great and innate qualities. Who that ever beheld him on the Munster circuit, when he was in the height of his fame, but must have admired his prodigious versatility of formidable powers. His pathos was often admirable, his humour flowed without effort or art. What jokes he uttered, what sarcasms! How well he worked his case, never throwing away a chance, never relaxing his untiring energies. How he disposed of a pugnacious attorney may be gathered from the following: For a round volley of abusive epithets nobody could surpass him. One of his droll comic sentences was often worth a speech of an hour in putting down an opponent, or in gaining supporters to his side. At Nisi Prius he turned his mingled client for abuse and drollery to great effect. He covered a witness with ridicule, or made a cause so ludicrous that the real grounds of complaint became invested with absurdity. One of the best things he ever said was in an assize town on the Munster circuit. The attorney of the side opposite to that on which O'Connell was retained was a gentleman remarkable for his combative qualities, delighted in being in a fight, and was foremost in many of the political scenes of excitement in his native town. His person was indicative of his disposition. His face was bold, menacing, and scornful in its expression. He had stamped on him the defiance and resolution of a pugilist. Upon either temple there stood erect a lock of hair which no brush could smooth down. These locks looked like horns, and added to the combative expression of his countenance. He was fiery in his nature, excessively spirited, and ejaculated rather than spoke to an audience. His speeches, consisting of a series of short, hissing, sputtering sentences, by no means devoid of talent of a certain kind. Add to all this that the gentleman was an Irish attorney and an Orangeman, and the reader may easily suppose that he was a character. Upon the occasion referred to, this gentleman gave repeated annoyance to O'Connell by interrupting him in the progress of the cause, by speaking to the witnesses, and by interfering in a manner altogether improper and unwarranted by legal custom. But it was no easy matter to make the combative attorney hold his peace. He too was an agitator in his own fashion. In vain did the counsel engaged with O'Connell in the cause sternly rebuke him. In vain did the judge admonish him to remain quiet. Up he would jump, interrupting the proceedings, hissing out his angry remarks and vociferations with vehemence. While O'Connell was in the act of pressing a most important question, he jumped up again, undismayed, solely for the purpose of interruption. O'Connell, losing all patience, suddenly turned round, and scowling at the disturber, shouted in a voice of thunder, "Sit down, you audacious, snarling, pugnacious ram-cat!" Scarcely had the words fallen from his lips when roars of laughter rang through the court. The judge himself laughed outright at the happy and humorous description of the combative attorney, who, pale with passion, gasped in inarticulate rage. The name of Ram-cat stuck to him through all his life. His encounter with Biddy Moriarty. One of the drollest scenes of vituperation that O'Connell ever figured in took place in the early part of his life. Not long after he was called to the bar, his character and peculiar talents received rapid recognition from all who were even casually acquainted with him. His talent for vituperative language was perceived, and by some he was, even in those days, considered matchless as a scold. There was, however, in that time in Dublin, a certain woman, Biddy Moriarty, who had a huckster's stall on one of the quays nearly opposite the Four Courts. She was a virago of the first order, very able with her fist, and still more formidable with her tongue. From one end of Dublin to the other she was notorious for her powers of abuse, and even in the provinces Mrs. Moriarty's language had passed into currency. The dictionary of Dublin slang had been considerably enlarged by her, and her voluble impudence had almost become proverbial. Some of O'Connell's friends, however, thought that he could beat her at the use of her own weapons. Of this, however, he had some doubts himself, when he had listened once or twice to some minor specimens of her Billingsgate. It was mooted once whether the young Kerry barrister could encounter her, and some one of the company, in O'Connell's presence, rather too freely ridiculed the idea of his being able to meet the famous Madame Moriarty. O'Connell never liked the idea of being put down, and he professed his readiness to encounter her, and even backed himself for the match. Bets were offered and taken. It was decided that the match should come off at once. The party adjourned to the huckster's stall, and there was the owner herself, superintending the sale of her small wares. A few loungers and ragged idlers were hanging round her stall, for Biddy was a character, and in her way was one of the sights of Dublin. O'Connell was very confident of success. He had laid an ingenious plan for overcoming her, and with all the anxiety of an ardent experimentalist, waited to put it into practice. He resolved to open the attack, At this time O'Connell's own party, and the loungers about the place, formed an audience quite sufficient to rouse Mrs. Moriarty, on public provocation, to a due exhibition of her powers. O'Connell commenced the attack. "What's the price of this walking stick, Mrs. What's your name?" "Moriarty, sir, is my name, and a good one it is. And what have you to say agin it?" "And 1 and 6pence's the price of the stick." "Troth, it's cheap as dirt, so it is." 1 and 6pence for a walking stick? Phew! Why, you know, you are no better than an impostor, to ask 18pence for what cost you 2pence. "Twopence your grandmother," replied Mrs. Biddy. "Do you mean to say that it's cheating the people I am? Impostor, indeed!" "Ay, impostor, and it's that I call you to your teeth," rejoined O'Connell. "Come, cut your stick, you cantankerous jackanapes." "Keep a civil tongue in your head, you old diagonal," cried O'Connell calmly. "Stop your jaw, you pug-nosed badger, or by this and that," cried Mrs. Moriarty, "I'll make you go quicker nor you came." "Don't be in a passion, my old radius, anger will only wrinkle your beauty." "By the hokey, if you say another word of impudence, I'll tan your dirty hide, you beastly common scrub, and sorry I'd be to soil my fists upon your carcass." "Phew, boys, what a passion old Biddy is in! I protest, as I am a gentleman." "Gentleman! Gentleman! The likes of you a gentleman! Wish a begor that bangs baganger. Why, you potato-faced pippin sneezer, when did a Madagascar monkey like you pick enough of common Christian dacency to hide your Kerry brogue?" Easy now," cried O'Connell, with imperturbable good humour. "Don't choke yourself with fine language, you old whiskey drinking parallelogram." "What's that you call me, you murdherin' villain?" roared Mrs. Moriarty, stung to fury. "I call you," answered O'Connell, "a parallelogram, and a Dublin judge and jury will say that it's no libel to call you so." "Oh, terranones! Oh, holy Biddy, that an honest woman like me should be called a parry-bellygrum to her face." "I'm none of your parry-bellygrums, you rascally gallows bird, you cowardly, sneaking, plate-licking bliggard." "Oh, not you, indeed," retorted O'Connell. "Why, I suppose you'll deny that you keep a hypotenuse in your house." "It's a lie for you, you dirty robber. I never had such a thing in my house, you swindling thief." "Why, sure, your neighbours all know very well that you keep not only a hypotenuse, but that you have 2 diameters locked up in your garret, and that you go out to walk with them every Sunday, you heartless old heptagon." "Oh, hear that, ye saints in glory! Oh, there's bad language from a fellow that wants to pass for a gintleman. May the devil fly away with you, you mischief from Munster, and make celery sauce from your rotten limbs, you mealy-mouthed tub of guts. Ah, you can't deny the charge, you miserable submultiple of a duplicate ratio. Go rinse your mouth in the Liffey, you nasty tickle-pitcher. After all the bad words you speak, it ought to be filthier than your face, you dirty chicken of Beelzebub. Rinse your own mouth, you wicked-minded old polygon. To the deuce I pitch you, you blustering intersection of a stinking superfleeces. You saucy tinker's apprentice, if you don't cease your jaw, I'll—" But here she gasped for breath, unable to hawk up any more words, for the last volley of O'Connell had nearly knocked the wind out of her. "While I have a tongue I'll abuse you, you most inimitable periphery. Look at her, boys. There she stands, a convicted perpendicular in petticoats. There's contamination in her circumference, and she trembles with guilt down to the extremities of her corollaries. Ah, you're found out, you rectilineal antecedent and equiangular old hag. 'Tis with you the devil will fly away, you porter-swiping similitude of the bisection of a vortex." Overwhelmed with this torrent of language, Mrs. Moriarty was silenced. Catching up a saucepan she was aiming at O'Connell's head, when he very prudently made a timely retreat. "You have won the wager, O'Connell, here's your bet," cried the gentleman who proposed the contest. O'Connell knew well the use of sound in the vituperation, and having to deal with an ignorant scold, determined to overcome her in volubility by using all the sesquipedalia verba which occur in Euclid. With these, and a few significant epithets, and a scoffing impudent demeanor, he had for once imposed silence on Biddy Moriarty. O'Connell and a bilking client. He used to lodge, when at Cork, at a stationer's of the name of O'Hara, in Patrick street, one of the principal thoroughfares of the city. There, during the assizes, there was always a crowd before his door, lounging under his windows, anxious to get a peep at the counsellor. Whenever he made his appearance, there was always a hearty cheer. On one occasion, an old friend of his, who had once belonged to the bar, Mr. K. something, a member of a most respectable family, called on O'Connell during the assizes to pay him a friendly visit. He found O'Connell engaged with a shrewd-looking farmer, who was consulting him on a knotty case. Heartily glad to see his old friend, O'Connell sprang forward, saying, "My dear Mr. K. something, I'm delighted to see you." The farmer, seeing the visitor come in, cunningly took the opportunity of sneaking away. He had got what he wanted, the opinion, but O'Connell had not got what he wanted, the fee. O'Connell at once followed the farmer, who had got the start by a flight of stairs. The rustic quickened his pace when he found that the counsellor was in chase. O'Connell saw that he could not catch the runaway client, who was now on the flight leading into the hall. He leant over the banister and made a grasp at the farmer's collar, but instead of the collar he caught the rustic's wig, which came away in his hand. O'Connell gave a shout of laughter, and, quick as thought, jumped in high spirits back to his room. "Hurrah! See, K. something, I've got the rascal's wig." Up went the window. "Three cheers for the counsellor! Long life to your honour! Arrah! Isn't he the man of the people?" "Ah, boys," said O'Connell with glee, "look here, what I've got for you. Here's the wig of a rascal that has just bilked me of a fee." Shouts of laughter rent the air as the wig was pitched out, to undergo a rapid process of radical reform at the hands of the mob. As the wigless farmer made his appearance, he was received with groans of derision, and was glad enough to escape with unbroken bones. Sow West and the Whigs. The following humorous scene took place in the Court House, Green Street, Dublin. The city of Dublin was often contested by Mr. John B. West, a conservative barrister of no ordinary talents, whose early end caused much regret. That gentleman was very heavy and clumsy in appearance, and moved very awkwardly. Lord Plunket humorously called him Sow West, a name that adhered to him most tenaciously. O'Connell was opposed to West on 3 or 4 different occasions. It is remarkable that the opening scenes at the Dublin elections are conducted with far more decorum than similar scenes in other parts of Ireland. All the masses are not admitted indiscriminately to the court where the hustings are placed. The people are admitted by tickets, half of which are allotted to each rival party. It is the interest of both parties to keep order, and the candidates and their friends are therefore heard with tolerable fairness. On the first day of a Dublin election, the most eloquent members of either party come forward to uphold their favourite principles. On the occasion referred to, O'Connell, in addressing the people, referred to the appearance of Sow West, whom he humorously quizzed upon the beauty of his appearance. In reply, Mr. West said, "Ah, my friends, it's all very well for Mr. O'Connell to attack me upon my appearance, but I can tell you, if you saw Mr. O'Connell without his wig, he does not present a face which is much to boast of." To the surprise of the spectators, no less than of Mr. West himself, O'Connell walked across, pulled off his wig, stood close by West, and cried out, "There now, which of us is the better looking? My wig is off." This sally of practical humour was received with bursts of laughter and cheering. O'Connell looked admirably, exhibiting a skull which, for volume and development, was not to be surpassed. Election and railway dinners. O'Connell's enormous appetite often excited surprise. He ate a prodigious quantity, even for a man of such large frame. At one of the Irish elections, he was greatly annoyed at his candidate being unseated for a few months by the blundering decision of the assessor. On the day when the election terminated, O'Connell was engaged to dine with a Roman Catholic priest, who piqued himself not a little on the honor of entertaining the Liberator. The company assembled at the appointed hour, much dispirited at the adverse turn which the election had taken at the last moment. O'Connell himself was particularly angry, and chafed with ill temper at the blunder of the assessor, who would not even listen to his arguments. Dinner came on, and a turkey pout smoked before the hospitable clergyman. "Mr. O'Connell, what part of the fowl shall I help you to?" cried the reverend host, with an air of empressement. His ears were electrified by O'Connell's rejoinder, "Oh, hang it, cut it through the middle, and give me half the bird." For an orator of a style so copious and diffuse, it was singular how admirably laconic he could become when he chose. During dinner, while occupied with the viands, he would express himself with the terseness and condescension of Tacitus. A railway company once gave a complimentary dinner at Kingston, and O'Connell, who had supported the bill in the House of Commons, was invited. The sea breeze on the Kingston pier sharpened his appetite. He had already partaken heartily of the second course, when one of the directors, seeing O'Connell's plate nearly empty, asked, "Pray, sir, what will you be helped to next?" Hastily glancing at the dishes, still untasted, O'Connell, with a full mouth, answered, "Mutton, well done, and much of it." Scene at Killini. O'Connell was a capital actor, and his dramatic delivery of a common remark was often highly impressive. Many years since, he went down to Kingston, near Dublin, with a party to visit a Queen's ship of war, which was then riding in the bay. After having seen it, O'Connell proposed a walk to the top of Killini Hill. Breaking from the rest of his party, he ascended to the highest point of the hill, in company with a young and real Irish patriot, whose character was brimful of national enthusiasm. The day was fine, and the view from the summit of the hill burst gloriously upon the sight. The beautiful bay of Dublin, like a vast sheet of crystal, was at their feet. The old city of Dublin stretched away to the west, and to the north was the old promontory of Howth, jutting forth into the sea. To the south were the Dublin and Wicklow mountains, enclosing the lovely vale of Shanganagh, rising picturesquely against the horizon. The scene was beautiful, with all the varieties of sunlight and shadow. O'Connell enjoyed it with nearly as much rapture as his youthful and ardent companion, who broke forth, "It is all Ireland. Oh, how beautiful! Thank God we see nothing English here. Everything we see is Irish." His rapture was interrupted by O'Connell gently laying his hand on his shoulder, and pointing to the ship of war at anchor, as he exclaimed, "A speck of the British power." The thought was electric. That speck, significantly pointed out by O'Connell, suggested the whole painful history of his fatherland to the memory of the ardent young Irishman. Section 7. Recording by James Carson. of Irish wit and humor. The author is anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by JCarson. Daniel O'Connell, Part 2. An insolent judge. The judges themselves often came in for a share of his animadversions when he deemed their judicial or other conduct deserved public censure, and when he pleaded as an advocate before them, their resentment betrayed itself. Singular to say, his practice was never injuriously affected by his boldness outside. Other men have suffered vitally from the political or personal hostility of judges. Curran was one of them. But O'Connell beat down the most formidable hatred, and compelled, by the sheer force of legal and intellectual power, the bitterest and most obstinate personal rancor to give way. He compelled pompous, despotic, and hostile judges to yield. He could not be awed. If they were haughty, he was proud. If they were malevolent, he was cuttingly sarcastic. It happened that he was by at an argument in one of the courts of Dublin, in the course of which a young Kerry attorney was called upon by the opposing counsel either to admit a statement as evidence, or to hand in some documents he could legally detain. O'Connell was not specially engaged. The discussion arose on a new trial motion, the issue to go down to the assizes. He did not interfere until the demand was made on the attorney, but he then stood up and told him to make no admission. He was about to resume his seat, when the judge, Baron McClelland, said, with a peculiar emphasis, "Mr. O'Connell, have you a brief in this case?" "No, my lord, I have not, but I will have one when the case goes down to the assizes." "When I," rejoined the judge, throwing himself back with an air of lofty scorn, "was at the bar, it was not my habit to anticipate briefs." "When you were at the bar," retorted O'Connell, "I never chose you for a model, and now that you are on the bench, I shall not submit to your dictation." Leaving his lordship to digest this retort, he took the attorney by the arm, and walked him out of the court. In this way he dealt with hostile judges. A witness cajoled. O'Connell knew so intimately the habits and character of the humbler class, that he was able, by cajolery or intimidation, to coerce them, when on the table, into truth-telling. He was once examining a witness, whose inebriety, at the time to which the evidence referred, it was essential to his client's case to prove. He quickly discovered the man's character. He was a fellow who may be described as half foolish with roguery. "Well, Darby," said the counsellor, taking him on the cross-examination, "you told the whole truth to that gentleman?" pointing to the counsel who had just examined the witness. "Yes, your honor, Counsellor O'Connell." "How do you know my name?" "Ah, sure, every one knows our own patriot." "Well, you are a good-humoured, honest fellow. Now tell me, Darby, did you take a drop of anything that day?" "Why, your honor, I took my share of a pint of spirits." "Your share of it. Now, by virtue of your oath, was not your share of it all but the pewter?" "Why then, dear knows, that's true for you, sir." The court was convulsed at both question and answer. It soon came out that the man was drunk, and was not therefore a competent witness. Thus O'Connell won the case for his client. His duel with Captain d'Estaire. When O'Connell found the government determined to strain the Convention Act to the utmost, and not permit the existence of any delegated committee for the management of Catholic affairs, he issued circulars to the number of gentlemen to meet him, as individuals, in Capel Street. From that circular arose the Catholic Association. It was at one of the early meetings of this body that he called the municipal functionaries of Dublin a beggarly corporation. He had become exceedingly obnoxious to the Orange party. He was an object of intense hatred, within the precincts of the castle. To get rid of such a man would be an invaluable service. The insult he had put on the immaculate and wealthy corporation offered too inviting an opportunity to be passed over. A champion of ascendancy appeared in the person of Captain d'Estaire. On the 1st of February, 1815, nearly 11 days after the insult was received, and 8 days after explanation was demanded and refused, this misled gentleman was advised to send a message. He addressed a letter in the following words: "Sir, Carrick's paper of the 23rd instant, in its report of the debates of a meeting of the Catholic gentlemen on the subject of a petition, states that you applied the appellation of beggarly to the corporation of this city, calling it a beggarly corporation, and therefore, as a member of that body, and feeling how painful such is, I beg leave to inquire whether you really used or expressed yourself in such language. I feel the more justified in calling on you on this occasion, as such language was not warranted or provoked by anything on the part of the corporation, neither was it consistent with the subject of your debate or the deportment of the other Catholic gentlemen who were present, and though I view it so inconsistent in every respect, I am in hopes the editor is under error, not you. I have further to request your reply in the course of the evening, and remain, sir, your obedient servant, J. N. D'Estaire, 11 Bachelor's Walk, 26th January, 1815. To Counsellor O'Connell, Merrion Square. Sir, in reply to your letter of yesterday, and without either admitting or disclaiming the expression respecting the corporation of Dublin in the print to which you allude, I deem it right to inform you that, from the calumnious manner in which the religion and character of the Catholics of Ireland are treated in that body, no terms attributed to me, however reproachful, can exceed the contemptuous feelings I entertain for that body in its corporate capacity, although doubtless it contains many valuable persons whose conduct as individuals, I lament, must necessarily be confounded in the acts of the general body. I have only to add that this letter must dose our correspondence on this subject. I am, etc., etc., Daniel O'Connell, Merrion Square, January 27, 1815. To J. N. D'Estaire, Esquire, 11 Bachelor's Walk, Dublin. Mr. D'Estaire was advised to persist in the correspondence, and addressed another letter, but directed it in a different handwriting, to Mr. O'Connell. It was returned to him by Mr. James O'Connell, enclosed in a letter couched in the following terms: "Sir, from the tenor of your letter of yesterday, my brother did not expect that your next communication would have been made in writing. He directed me to open his letters in his absence. Your last letter, bearing a different address from the former one, was opened by me, but upon perceiving the name subscribed, I have declined to read it, and by his direction I return it to you enclosed and unread. I am, sir, your obedient servant, James O'Connell, Merrion Square, Friday evening. To J. N. D'Estaire, Esquire, 11 Bachelor's Walk." After a number of insulting letters from D'Estaire, his long-expected hostile message arrived. Major Macnamara of Doolin, having been commissioned by O'Connell, proceeded to Sir Edward Stanley, who acted as the friend of D'Estaire, to arrange the meeting. The hour appointed was 3 o'clock on Wednesday. The place, Bishop's Court, Demesne, Lord Ponsonby's seat, in the county Kildare, 13 miles distant from Dublin. It was proposed by him that the mode of fighting should be after the following fashion: that both should be handed a brace of pistols, reserve their shots until the signal, and then fire when they pleased, advancing or retiring after each shot as they thought proper. Major McNamara would not assent to this mode of fighting without first consulting O'Connell and his friends. O'Connell at once directed him to accept the terms. Major McNamara then returned to Sir Edward Stanley, and finally arranged the meeting. The parties proceeded to take their ground, and were handed a brace of pistols each. The signal was given. Both reserved their fire for some moments. D'Esterre first changed his position, moving a pace towards the left hand, and then stepped towards O'Connell. His object was to induce him to fire, more or less, at random. He lifted his pistol, as if about to fire. O'Connell instantly presented, pulled the trigger, and the unfortunate man fell. In close attendance on O'Connell at the ground were Major McNamara, Nicholas Purcell O'Gorman, and Richard Nugent Bennet, as seconds and friends, for all may be said to have acted in the double capacity. It was reported in Dublin that O'Connell was shot, and a party of dragoons were dispatched from Dublin for the protection of D'Esterre. On their way, the officer by whom they were commanded met, on its return, the carriage containing O'Connell and his brother. The officer called on the postilion to stop, whereupon Mr. James O'Connell pulled down the window. The officer, addressing him, asked if they had been present at the duel, to which he replied in the affirmative. The officer then said, "Is it true Mr. O'Connell has been shot?" Mr. James O'Connell replied, "No, the reverse is the fact. Mr. D'Esterre has unfortunately fallen." The announcement had a visible effect upon the military. They were not prepared for the intelligence, and something like consternation was exhibited. The carriage was allowed to proceed, the military party being evidently not aware who were its occupants. When D'Esterre fell, the spectators present could not refrain from giving expression to their excited feelings. They actually shouted, and a young collegian who was present, and who became a Protestant clergyman, was so carried away by the general feeling as to fling up his hat in the air and shout, "Hurrah for O'Connell!" Very different was the conduct of the three occupants of O'Connell's carriage. They displayed no exultation. The moment D'Esterre fell, they went off, and though the place of the meeting was near Naas, they were close to Dublin before a single word was exchanged between them. At last O'Connell broke the silence, saying, "I fear he is dead. He fell so suddenly." "Where do you think he was hit?" "In the head, I think," said his medical friend. "That cannot be. I aimed low. The ball must have entered near the thigh." This will be considered a remarkable observation when, as was subsequently found, the wound was inflicted in the part mentioned by O'Connell. Being one of the surest shots that ever fired a pistol, he could have hit his antagonist where he pleased. But his object was merely in self-defence, to wound him in no mortal part, and he aimed low with that intention. The excitement in Dublin, when the result was known, cannot be described, and indeed is scarcely credited by those who were not then in the metropolis. Over 700 gentlemen left their cards at O'Connell's the day after the occurrence. Great commiseration was felt for D'Esterre's family, but it was considered that he himself lost his life foolishly. It may be added that he was an officer in the navy, and an eccentric character. He at one time played off rather a serious joke upon his friends, who resided near Cork. He wrote to them from abroad that he was sentenced to be hanged for mutiny, and implored of them to use every interest to save him. Lord Shannon interested himself in the affair, and the greatest trouble was taken to obtain a pardon, but it turned out to be a hoax practised by D'Esterre when under the influence of the jolly god. Knowing his character, many even of opposite politics, notwithstanding the party spirit that then prevailed, regretted the issue the unfortunate man provoked. O'Connell and Secretary Goulburn. Mr. Goulburn, while Secretary of Ireland, visited Killarney when O'Connell, then on circuit, happened to be there. Both stopped at Finn's Hotel, and chanced to get bedrooms opening off the same corridor. The early habits of O'Connell made him up at cockcrow. Finding the hall door locked, and so being hindered from walking outside, he commenced walking up and down the corridor. To pass the time he repeated aloud some of Moore's poetry, and had just uttered the lines, "We tread the land that bore us, the green flag flutters o'er us, the friends we've tried are by our side." At this moment Goulburn popped his night-capped head out to see what was the matter. O'Connell instantly pointed his finger at him, and finished the verse, "And the foe we hate before us." In went Goulburn's head in the greatest hurry. Entrapping a witness. An illustration of his dexterity in compassing an unfortunate culprit's acquittal may be here narrated. He was employed in defending a prisoner who was tried for a murder committed in the vicinity of Cork. The principal witness swore strongly against the prisoner. One corroborative circumstance was, that the prisoner's hat was found near the place where the murder took place. The witness swore positively the hat produced was the one found, and that it belonged to the prisoner, whose name was James. "By virtue of your oath, you are positive that this is the same hat?" "Yes." "Did you examine it carefully before you swore in your informations that it was the prisoner's?" "Yes." "Now let me see," said O'Connell, and he took up the hat and began carefully to examine the inside. He then spelled aloud the name James slowly, thus: J-A-M-E-S. "Now, do you mean those words were in the hat when you found it?" "I do." "Did you see them there?" "I did." "This is the same hat?" "It is." "Now, my lord," said O'Connell, holding up the hat to the bench, "there is an end to the case. There is no name whatever inscribed in the hat." The result was instant acquittal. Gaining over a jury. At a Cork assizes, many years ago, he was employed in an action of damages for diverting a stream from its regular channel, or diverting so much of it as inflicted injury on some party who previously benefited by its abundance. The injury was offered by a nobleman, and his attorney, on whose advice the proceeding was adopted, was a man of corpulent proportions, with a face bearing the ruddy glow of rude health, but, flushed in a crowded court, assumed momentarily a color like that imparted by intemperance. He really was a most temperate man. O'Connell dwelt on the damage his client had sustained by the unjust usurpation. The stream should have been permitted to follow its old and natural course. There was neither law nor justice in turning it aside from his client's fields. He had a right to all its copiousness, and the other party should have allowed him full enjoyment. In place of that, the latter monopolized the water. He diminished it. It became every day small by degrees, and beautifully less. "There is not now," he said, "gentlemen of the jury, a tenth of the ordinary quantity. The stream is drying up, and so low is it, and so little of it is there, that," continued he, turning to the rubicund attorney, and naming him, "there isn't enough of it to make grog for Fogarty." A roar of laughter followed, and it was not stopped by the increased rosiness and embarrassment of the gentleman who became the victim of the learned advocate's humorous allusion. The act in his sally was, in endeavoring to create an impression on the jury that his poor client was sacrificed by the harsh conduct of a grog-drinking attorney, and thus create prejudice against the plaintiff's case. Thus did O'Connell gain the hearts of Irish juries, and thus did his, indulging his own natural humor on the public platform, gain the affections of his countrymen. Paddy and the Parson. In June 1832, O'Connell addressed a meeting of the Political Union of the London Working Classes. In his address he humorously and graphically describes the system of passive resistance then adopted against the payment of tithes, in the following amusing dialogue between Paddy and the parson. "And how does Paddy act? Does he disobey the laws?" "No, Paddy," says the parson, "you owe me £1 17 shillings 6pence." "And what may it be for, your reverence?" says Pat. "Tithes, Paddy." "Arrah, thin I suppose your riverence gave some value fornit. I was born. For devil a bit I ever seen since." Roars of laughter. "But your riverence, I suppose, has law for it." "Bless the law, your honour, and sure I wouldn't be after going to disobey it." "But plaise your riverence, I have no money." Great laughter. "Ah, Pat, but you've a cow there." "Yes, your reverence, that's the cow that gives food to Norry and the 14 childer." "Well, Paddy, then I must distrain that cow." "If your honour has law for it, to be sure you will." Well, what does Paddy do? He stamps the word tithes upon her side, and the parson can't find a soul to take the cow. So he gets a regiment and a half by way of brokers. Much laughter. 14 or 15 companies, with those amiable young gentlemen, their officers at their head, who march 17 or 18 miles across the bog of Allen to take his cow. They bring the cow to Carlow. When they get there they find a great crowd assembled. The parson rubs his hands with glee. "Plenty of customers for the cow," quoth he to himself. The cow is put up at £2. No bidder. £1. No bidder. 10 shillings. 5 shillings. 6pence. 1.5 pence. Cheers. Not a soul will bid. And back goes the cow to Norry and the 14 childer. Continued cheers. A martial judge. In court his usual mirth and ready wit never failed him, and he kept the bar and listening bystanders in constant hilarity. He made an excellent hit during the trial of Sir George Bingham for assault during the tithe agitation. The General's aide de camp, Captain Berners of the Royal Artillery, was under examination. A junior counsel asked the witness, "What is the meaning of the military phrase, 'ride him down'?" "Do you think," interposed O'Connell, "we are here to get an explanation of plain English from an English aide de camp, with his tongue in holiday dress?" Then turning to the witness, he said, "You belong to the artillery and understand horse language?" "Yes." Mr. Justice Moore, who tried the case here, observed, "I ought to understand it, Mr. O'Connell, for I was a long while captain of cavalry." "Yes, you were, my lord," replied O'Connell, "and I recollect you a long time a sergeant too." This ready sally caused a burst of laughter throughout the whole court. Retentive memory. At Darrynane he was sitting one morning surrounded by country people, some asking his advice, some his assistance, others making their grievances known. Amongst the rest was a farmer rather advanced in life, a swaggering sort of fellow, who was desirous to carry his point by impressing the Liberator with the idea of his peculiar honesty and respectability. He was anxious that O'Connell should decide a matter in dispute between him and a neighboring farmer, who, he wished to insinuate, was not as good as he ought to be. For my part, I, at least, can boast that neither I nor mine were ever brought before a judge, or sent to jail, however it was with others. "Stop, my fine fellow," cried the Liberator, "let me see," pausing a moment, "let me see. It is now just 25 years ago, last August, that I myself saved you from transportation, and had you discharged from the dock." The man was thunderstruck. He thought such a matter could not be retained in the great man's mind. he shrunk away, murmuring that he should get justice elsewhere, and never appeared before the Liberator afterwards. A political hurrah at a funeral. Ascending the mountain road between Dublin and Glencullen, in company with an English friend, OConnell was met by a funeral. The mourners soon recognized him, and immediately broke into a vociferous hurrah for their political favorite, much to the astonishment of the Sassenach, who, accustomed to the solemn and lugubrious decorum of English funerals, was not prepared for an outburst of Celtic enthusiasm upon such an occasion. A remark being made on the oddity of a political hurrah at a funeral, it was replied that the corpse would have doubtless cheered lustily too, if he could. Refusal of office. In 1838, on the morning when O'Connell received from the government the offer to be appointed Lord Chief Baron, he walked over to the window, saying, "This is very kind indeed, but I haven't the least notion of taking the offer. Ireland could not spare me now. Not but that, if she could, I don't at all deny that the office would have great attractions for me. Let me see now. There would not be more than about 8 days' duty in the year. I would take a country house near Dublin, and walk into town, and during the intervals of judicial labor I'd go to Darrynane. I should be idle in the early part of April, just when the jack hares leave the most splendid trails upon the mountains. In fact, I should enjoy the office exceedingly upon every account, if I could but accept it consistently with the interest of Ireland. But I cannot." A mistaken Frenchman. When travelling in France during the time of his sojourn at St. Omer's, O'Connell encountered a very talkative Frenchman, who incessantly poured forth the most bitter tirades against England. O'Connell listened in silence, and the Frenchman, surprised at his indifference, at last exclaimed, "Do you hear, do you understand what I am saying, sir?" "Yes, I hear you, I comprehend you perfectly." "Yet you do not seem angry." "Not in the least." "How can you so tamely bear the censures I pronounce against your country?" "Sir, England is not my country. Censure her as much as you please, you cannot offend me. I am an Irishman, and my countrymen have as little reason to love England as yours have, perhaps less." Epistolary bores. The number of letters received by O'Connell upon trivial subjects was sufficient to try his patience, as the following will show. A letter once arrived from New York, which on opening he found to contain a minute description of a Queen Anne's farthing recently found by the writer, with a modest request that Ireland's Liberator might negotiate the sale of the said farthing in London, where, as many intelligent persons had assured him, he might make his fortune by it. Another modest correspondent was one Peter Waldron, also of New York, whose epistle ran thus: "Sir, I have discovered an old paper, by which I find that my grandfather, Peter Waldron, left Dublin about the year 1730. You will very much oblige me by instituting an immediate inquiry who the said Peter Waldron was, whether he possessed any property in Dublin or elsewhere, and to what amount, and in case that he did, you will confer a particular favor on me by taking immediate steps to recover it, and, if successful, forwarding the amount to me at New York." At another time a Protestant clergyman wrote to apprise him that he and his family were all in prayer for his conversion to the Protestant religion, and that the writer was anxious to engage in controversy with so distinguished an antagonist. The letters with which he was persecuted, soliciting patronage, were innumerable. "Everybody writes to me about everything," said he, "and the applicants for places, without a single exception, tell me that one word of mine will infallibly get them what they want. One word. Oh, how sick I am of that one word." Some of his rural correspondents entertained odd ideas of his attributes. He said that from one of them he got a letter commencing with "Awful Sir." Sir R. Peel's opinion of O'Connell. Sir Robert Peel is said to have expressed his high appreciation of O'Connell's parliamentary abilities. While the Reform Bill was under discussion, the speeches of his friends and foes were one day canvassed at Lady Beauchamp's. On O'Connell's name being mentioned, some critic fastidiously said, "Oh, a broguing Irish fellow. Who would listen to him? I always walk out of the House when he opens his lips." "Come, Peel," said Lord Westmoreland, "let me hear your opinion." "My opinion candidly is," replied Sir Robert, "that if I wanted an efficient and eloquent advocate, I would readily give up all the other orators of whom we have been talking, provided I had with me this same broguing Irish fellow." At the Bishop of Waterford's table, the following anecdote was related by O'Connell: "My grandmother had 22 children, and half of them lived beyond the age of 90. Old Mr. O'Connell of Derrynane pitched upon an oak tree to make his own coffin, and mentioned his purpose to a carpenter. In the evening the butler entered after dinner to say that the carpenter wanted to speak with him. "For what?" asked my uncle. "To talk about your honour's coffin," said the carpenter, putting his head inside the door over the butler's shoulder. I wanted to get the fellow out, but my uncle said, "Oh, let him in by all means." "Well, friend, what do you want to say to me about my coffin?" "Only, sir, that I'll saw up the oak tree that your honour was speaking of into 7-foot plank." "That would be wasteful," answered my uncle. "I never was more than 6 feet and an inch in my vamps, the best day ever I saw." "But your honour will stretch after death," said the carpenter. "Not 11 inches, I'm sure, you blockhead, but I'll stretch no doubt, perhaps a couple of inches or so." "Well, make my coffin 6 feet 6, and I'll warrant that will give me room enough." "I remember," said O'Connell, "being counsel at a special commission in Kerry against a Mr. S. something, and having occasion to press him somewhat hard in my speech. He jumped up in the court and called me a purse-proud blockhead. I said to him, in the first place, I have got no purse to be proud of, and secondly, if I be a blockhead, it is better for you as I am counsel against you. However, just to save you the trouble of saying so again, I'll administer a slight rebuke." Whereupon I whacked him soundly on the back with the President's cane. Next day he sent me a challenge by William Ponsonby of Croteau, but very shortly after he wrote to me to state that since he had challenged me, he had discovered that my life was inserted in a very valuable lease of his. "Under these circumstances," he continued, "I cannot afford to shoot you, unless, as a precautionary measure, you first insure your life for my benefit. If you do, then hie for powder and ball. I'm your man." Now this seems so ludicrously absurd that it is almost incredible. Yet it is literally true. S. something was a very timid man, yet he fought 6 duels. In fact, he fought them all out of pure fear. End of Section 8. Recording by James Carson. End of Irish Wit and Humour. The author is anonymous.